And the Oscar goes to...
The Oscar goes to...
And the Oscar goes to...
And the Oscar goes to...
It's the 75th Academy Awards from 2003. It took place March 23rd of 2003 at the Kodak Theater in Hollywood, 8:30 Eastern Time. Again, 24 categories. They honored the films released in the year 2002, and it was aired on television on ABC. Produced again by Gil Cates and directed by Louis J. Horvitz, and hosted by actor Steve Martin. It was his second time hosting. Steve Martin also hosted 2 years prior for the 73rd ceremony. And they had the awards for technical achievement hosted by Kate Hudson. They were held March 1st at the Regent Beverly Wilshire Hotel. Big night for the movie Chicago, kind of the rebirth of the screen musical. Chicago won 6 awards, and it even won Best Picture in 2003. The Pianist won 3 awards. That was the second most awards for a movie of the night. And 33 million viewers watched, which unfortunately made it the least watched and lowest rated Oscars at the time. But there were some reasons for that we'll get into in just a bit. As far as the winners and nominees go, the nominees were announced February 11th, 2003 at the Samuel Goldwyn Theater by Frank Pearson and Marissa Tomei. Frank Pearson, 1925 to 2012, I believe he was the Academy president back then. And of course, you know Marissa Tomei from My Cousin Vinny and other films. Chicago led the way with 13 nominations. It was the 8th film to receive that many nominations. The movie Gangs of New York came in second at 10 nominations. Chicago became the first musical to win Best Picture since Oliver in 1968. That's Oliver with an exclamation mark. And at 29, Adrian Brody became the youngest person to win Best Actor. At 29, it's kind of hard to believe that the youngest was that old, if you ask me. Now, it was the 13th nomination as well for Meryl Streep. She was the most nominated actor in history, still the most nominated actor in history, actor or actress. And Jack Nicholson's 12th nomination extended his lead for male actor nominations. So Jack Nicholson right on the heels of Meryl Streep. I think Streep basically blew Jack Nicholson out of the water. Many years after 2003, she's got a lot more nominations. Julianne Moore was the 9th performer to earn 2 acting nominations in the same year. Lose Yourself from the movie 8 Mile, the Eminem movie, was the first rap song ever to win Best Original Song. And Jack Nicholson and Michael Caine became the 2nd and 3rd performers to receive acting nominations in 5 different decades, the 60s to the 2000s. Laurence Olivier was the first one to get that honor. They gave out the honorary award to Peter O'Toole, 1932 to 2013, for his remarkable talents, which provided many historical moments in cinema. As far as the presenters of the big awards go, Kirk and Michael Douglas presented the Best Picture Award. Harrison Ford, Best Director. Denzel Washington gave out the award for Best Actress, and Halle Berry gave out the award for Best Actor. Those were the prior Best Actors and Best Actresses, or Best Actress from the Academy Awards the year before. As far as the ceremony goes, Gil Cates, by that time a veteran of the Oscars, it was his 11th time overseeing the event. He brought back Steve Martin to host, saying he's a host who is witty, clever, sharp, intelligent, quick on his feet, and always on top of the unfolding action. So Gil Cates said, we're bringing Steve Martin back, and people are going to love him. Billy Crystal was initially approached but turned it down. And this was the first Oscars, 2003, first Oscars to be broadcast in HD. So if you were lucky enough to have high definition in 2003, you were able to see the Oscars in high def for the first time. To commemorate the 75th anniversary, 59 Oscars who received competitive and honorary awards appeared on stage together during a segment called Oscars Family Album. It happened coinciding with the 2003 American invasion of Iraq, not the, I guess the Family Album thing did too, but I'm talking about the whole ceremony. So this is why the ratings probably were at their lowest. You had the American invasion of Iraq and people glued to the television for the news coming from the Middle East. So they had to kind of tone down the Oscars, and there was really genuinely less interest generally than years prior. The red carpet festivities were curtailed. It wasn't a huge, lavish event that we're used to. Kate Blanchett, Jim Carrey, and Will Smith actually pulled out of the presentation. A lot of people called for its postponement. They said, look, we got bigger fish to fry here. We're having a war in Iraq, and we should probably not be doing the Oscars. ABC News anchor Peter Jennings gave news briefs, actually, during the broadcast. So they would cut to commercial, and then Peter Jennings would say, here's what's going on in Iraq. The movie Bowling for Columbine won Best Documentary, and very, very controversial acceptance speech by Michael Moore, one of the more memorable Oscar moments. He says, we live in a time with fictitious election results and fictitious presidents sending us to war for fictitious reasons. If that was given, I think in 2016, everyone will be on their feet cheering probably. If Bush was president in 2016. In 2003, the attacks of September 11th were a little bit more fresh on people's minds, so they were a little more gung-ho about probably about not questioning the government and not questioning why we're going into war. So people, though people did cheer, other people were booing, and it was very, very mixed. Kind of like the Vanessa Redgrave speech in the 1978 Oscars. As far as the critical review and TV ratings, the critical review was mostly positive for the event. Martin used wit and insider status, his Hollywood insider status, to kind of win the night. But the viewership suffered a 21% decrease from the previous year. 33.04 million people watched it. Of course, a lot of people were glued to cable news coverage of the war. And it won 3 Emmys. Usually the Oscars wins like 1 Emmy, but this year it won 3. Art direction, light direction, and music as well. And the In Memoriam segment was presented by Susan Sarandon, and the luminaries who passed away the year prior that were honored included Lou Wasserman, Dudley Moore, Rod Steiger, Milton Berle, Rosemary Clooney, Richard Harris, James Coburn, and Billy Wilder. 5 movies that I'm going to be reviewing from the 2003 Oscars, and they include the Best Picture winner, Chicago, Gangs of New York, The Hours, The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, and The Pianist. So, hey, let's get to it.
Catherine Zeta-Jones, Renee Zellweger, and Richard Gere.
Are you guilty or not guilty?
Don't you want to take my picture?
Good night, folks.
Gotcha.
Chicago.
We start with the Best Picture winner of the 2003 Academy Awards, and that, of course, went to Chicago, an American musical comedy, crime legal drama as well. Interesting combination of things. Now, the movie was based on a musical by the same name. The musical first premiered in the 70s and was a big bomb. People didn't like it because of the darkness of the theme, but it did have a resurrection in the mid-90s as kind of a minimalist play, and it enjoyed a lot of success then, and then they, of course, created this movie, which won Best Picture. It explores the themes of celebrity, scandal, and corruption in Chicago during the Jazz Age. And Chicago stars Catherine Zeta-Jones as Velma Kelly, who's a showgirl arrested for the murder of her husband, Charlie, as well as her sister, Veronica. Renee Zellweger also stars. She plays Roxy Hart, who's a housewife who's aspiring to be a vaudevillian, and she's also arrested for murder of her deceitful lover. Richard Gere plays Billy Flynn, a smooth-talking, fraudulent lawyer. Queen Latifah plays Mama Morton, who's the matron of Cook County Jail. And John C. Reilly, who's in every movie this year. It's unbelievable how John C. Reilly was in 3 of the 5 Best Picture nominees. He plays Amos Hart, who's Roxy's naive, simple-minded husband. Christine Baranski and Lucy Liu are also featured in the movie. And a basic synopsis of the plot: Chicago centers on Velma Kelly and Roxy Hart, who are 2 murderesses who find themselves in jail together awaiting trial in 1920 Chicago. Now, Velma, who is a vaudevillian, and Roxy, who's a housewife, fight for the fame that's going to keep them from the gallows. The movie was directed and choreographed by Rob Marshall and adapted by screenwriter Bill Condon. And it gets pretty good critical reviews, an 87% on Rotten Tomatoes, and 82 out of 100 on Metacritic. A writer from the Daily Telegraph called it the best screen musical in 30 years. Roger Ebert called it big, brassy, and fun. But other reviews did claim the film is a little too streamlined, so it did have its detractors as well. Did quite well in the box office. It got $306,776,732 worldwide. It's the highest gross of any film never to reach number 1 or number 2 in weekly North American box office history at the time. That was a record that was broken by Alvin and the Chipmunks, The Squeakquel. So you don't want your record broken by a movie like that. As far as the legacy goes, along with the movie Moulin Rouge and 8 Mile, it was widely considered to be responsible for the reemergence of the musical genre in the 21st century, which you do see a lot of musicals pop up. Of course, the most recent one that comes to mind is La La Land. So as we get into our review for Chicago, we start with the plot. I give the plot for Chicago a 3.5 out of 5. I thought it was a fun plot. It was a little simplistic, and it is a little streamlined. I will say that. I do agree with that part of the review. But instead of the plot being built around the music, which so many musicals are, I like the approach that it took, whereas the music was built around the plot. Plot number 1, music number 2, even if it is a musical. You can always create music that's really good quality music based on the plot you have. Chicago really is a journey of twists, albeit maybe somewhat predictable twists, and sequences that make it kind of stripped down. You kind of get a stripped down feel. It's not this grandiose musical feeling that you get from a lot of musicals. And you do have a genuine interest in the fates of each character. As I mentioned earlier, it is a bit straightforward. It is a little too simplistic. There's really no avenues of irony in any of the characters' stories that are interesting to me. But it is kind of a visual spectacle. And musical spectacle, too, of course. As far as the acting goes, I give the acting a 3.5 out of 5 as well. I thought Renee Zellweger is the star of the film. She's not only the actual star, she's the star acting-wise as well. She really plays a vapid, sociopathic character. Very sociopathic, very narcissistic character. She gives great facial expressions, I think, all throughout the movie. She feigns sweetness, but you can clearly see right through her, I think. And she does a great job emoting that. I thought Richard Gere really turned on the charm, playing the Billy Flynn character. He's shyster of a lawyer, and he looks the part, he plays the part perfectly. On the flip side, even though she won Best Supporting Actress for her role, I wasn't too awfully impressed by Catherine Zeta-Jones. I think she had a definite on-screen presence, a definite charisma on-screen, but the actual acting that's coming out of her, I didn't think was the strongest in the world. And the same can be said for Queen Latifah for me. I think Queen Latifah could have put forth a more powerful, bombastic kind of performance than she did. I thought she was a little too subtle for that role. Directing and cinematography, I give that a perfect score, a 5 out of 5. I thought the choreography of dancing, the dancing numbers, makes the movie shine. Absolutely shine. Unbelievable choreography. The guy who did the choreography, I believe, for the original play, passed away some years prior before this filming. And they really did a good job recreating his choreography in this film. A lot of great smoky nightclub and jail scenes as well. They're all very well filmed, so a very good job with cinematography in that film. Soundtrack, I give a 4 out of 5. It is a musical. I know the soundtrack's going to be one of the main focal points of the film. I thought it was really good. Not perfect, but really good. I think it really bolsters the plot. The songs All That Jazz, Cell Block Tango, and Razzle Dazzle top the music for me. There are a few other ones as well. There are a couple of pedestrian songs in the movie. I wasn't a huge fan of the Mr. Cellophane song. I just didn't think that was... It is catchy, and it's something that is kind of stuck in my head as I'm talking about it, but I just didn't grab me as much as it probably should have. And the overall aura of Chicago, I give a 3.5 out of 5. I think the music is the memory, not so much the plot. The smoky nightclub numbers are really the ones that stand out. It does get a minimal feel. Not quite this bombastic, big-time showy kind of feel that you get from musicals, at least in my opinion. It's not quite as grandiose as it could be. And I kind of wish it was a little more grandiose. You do get a romanticized feeling of Chicago, too. And the scope of the city isn't as wide, and that's probably what geared me toward not really giving it much more of an aura. It really doesn't depict Chicago as this gigantic town to me. Almost a mid-level city kind of feel to it. So let's go through our results here. We have 3.5 for plot. We have 3.5 for acting. 5 for directing and cinematography. 4 for soundtrack. 3.5 for Aura, giving Chicago a total of 19.5 out of 25 and a score of 78.
On my challenge, we have met at this chosen ground to settle for good and all. Who holds sway over the 5 points? Us natives or the foreign hordes?
It's the historical film Gangs of New York from 2002. Now, this film delves into some of the forgotten history of Civil War era New York City. When we think of the Civil War, we mostly think of the battles in the South and a few of them up north in Gettysburg and whatnot. We don't really think of New York City when we think of the Civil War era, but this one really sets the stage for a great story. It was set in mid-19th century in the 5 Points district of New York City. This film was directed by Martin Scorsese, and it was written by Jay Cox, Stephen Zalen, and Kenneth Lonergan. It was inspired by Herbert Asbury's 1928 nonfiction book of the same name, Gangs of New York. And it was actually filmed not in New York City, it was filmed in Italy, in Cinecittà, Rome. They needed a big soundstage to produce these lavish sets. I don't want to say lavish because it's kind of slummy, but they needed a big soundstage. Obviously, they're not going to film in New York City. There's not much room there. So they found this big, giant studio in Rome that they were able to create these unbelievable sets. It was distributed by Miramax Films, and it stars Leonardo DiCaprio as Amsterdam Vallon. Daniel Day-Lewis plays the evil William Cutting. Cameron Diaz plays Jenny Everdeen. And this film begins in 1846. It quickly jumps to 1862. The two principal issues of the era in New York City were Irish immigration to the city, as well as the federal government's execution of the ongoing Civil War. And the story follows gang leader Bill the Butcher Cutting in his roles as crime boss and political kingmaker under the helm of Boss Tweed, played by Jim Broadbent. Now, the film ends in a really violent confrontation, a huge climactic scene at the end of this film between Cutting and his mob, with the protagonist Amsterdam Vallon and his immigrant allies, which coincides with the New York draft riots of 1863. This is one of those movies that you kind of want to study history a little more. They don't teach this in most schools. A little bit of the background, Martin Scorsese actually grew up in Little Italy in Manhattan, and he used to kind of go around town and look at these old buildings. He noticed that some of these buildings were older than others, and the newer buildings actually had basements that were really, really relics, ancient relics of old buildings, and he was really interested in this world before the modern New York City was built. So we came across Asbury's book back in 1970, so he's been interested in that film for years and years, and it took some 32 years, I suppose, to actually get it on screen. There was a lot of attention paid to the speech of the characters. It was really kind of hard to find recordings. Obviously, back then, they didn't really have much at all to go by, but they were able to get some of the dialects that they thought were close to real from back then, and they used Irish brogues. They used a voice coach, Tim Monick, who had some expertise on how to inflect that speech. This movie had a lot of clashes in its production, though. 3 years of them, actually. Scorsese defended his artistic vision. Harvey Weinstein, who funded the movie, big, powerful Hollywood exec, said he wanted more of a streamlined film and more of a crowd pleaser, and Scorsese just wanted it to be right and wanted it to be good, too. Robbie Robertson supervised the soundtrack's collection of eclectic pop, folk, and neoclassical tracks. Interesting soundtrack to this film. And it did pretty well. It got $193,772,504 in the box office worldwide. Generally positive reviews, gets a 75% on Rotten Tomatoes out of 202 reviews, a 72 out of 100 on Metacritic, and the late great Roger Ebert praised the film, but he said it did kind of fall short of Scorsese's best work. General consensus is it's a good film, but not one of Scorsese's quintessential masterpieces. Richard Roeper, on the other hand, did call the film a masterpiece and declared it a leading contender for Best Picture. But some critics were disappointed and they thought it was well short of the hype. A lot of hype for this movie. I remember that year very, very vividly. Of course, it went up against Two Towers, which was the blockbuster film of 2002. So let's get into our review now of Gangs of New York. I give the plot of Gangs of New York a 3 out of 5. I thought it had a pretty slow beginning. Had a great first scene that kind of set the tone for things, but it kind of dragged a little bit, but it picked up at the end, and it really climaxes in a great scene at the end of this that kind of ties things together. There's a lot of stuff happening, a lot of different gangs. I mean, we got 5 gangs. We got representatives from each gang. We got all sorts of fighting going on. You don't really know what's what. You almost have to kind of crack open a history book or search Wikipedia in 2017 and find out exactly what went on. And there was a lot of political content. I mean, it is basically politics is what we're talking about. Strong-arming people and bullying politics, but politics nonetheless. And it gets a little murky, I think. The acting I give a 3 out of 5. Or I'm sorry. The acting I give a 3.5 out of 5. I think Daniel Day-Lewis, as he usually is in his films, is the standout. You want to kill him. One of those characters you just want to jump into the screen and just murder him yourself and get your own revenge. He does a great job in this role as Bill Cutting. Leonardo DiCaprio, I thought was okay in the film. He's very young. I believe DiCaprio at the time was in his early 20s. He does have a little bit of a strained accent and scowls all the time, although I guess you got to scowl all the time because look what's happened to his character through his life. Cameron Diaz, as she usually is in most movies, very average in this film. She's just there. I don't think she brings much to the table. As far as the directing and cinematography, I give that a 4 out of 5. I think the choreographed fighting was top-notch. The knife throwing. There's a knife throwing scene from Bill the Butcher. Unbelievably done. Really edge-of-your-seat kind of stuff. Really well filmed. The scenes of the 5 Points, they recreated this entire set based on a painting that existed from back in the day. There's really nothing they could have really gone by other than this painting to actually recreate that set, and they did a great job recreating it. Very, very dark movie. Soundtrack and sound editing, I give that a 4 out of 5. I think the Battle March theme from the beginning, this Irish march that they use in the beginning and the end of this film really kind of sticks in your head. Really strange kind of tin whistle kind of music. A lot of period music from the time, and a lot of dark, very serious tunes. So very well done soundtrack and sound editing. The Aura. I give The Aura of Gangs of New York a 4 out of 5. It really made me want to know more about this moment in history. Kind of like Les Miserables wanted me to kind of look at the French Revolution and exactly how Paris was set up back then and all that stuff. This made me want to see what New York was. Maybe want to learn about the draft riots of 1863, something I knew nothing about whatsoever until I actually watched this movie. The battle song, as I mentioned before, really sticks with me, and the hatred of Daniel Day-Lewis's character. Those are the 3 things that really, really stand out as far as Gangs of New York. So, telling the results of Gangs of New York, I give the plot a 3, I give the acting a 3.5, I give the directing and cinematography a 4, soundtrack and sound editing a 4, and Aura as well a 4, giving Gangs of New York a total of 18.5 out of 25 for a score of 74.
3 different women.
This life, it's what I've always wanted. I had an idea of our happiness.
Each living a lie.
I wish, for your sake, Leonard, I could be happy in this quietness.
Each putting someone else's life.
Good morning, Mrs. Dalloway.
First.
The 2002 British-American drama film The Hours, a film directed by Stephen Daldry. That name rings a bell. He also did the movies Billy Elliot, The Reader, and Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close. This movie stars Meryl Streep, who plays Clarissa Vaughn, in present time meaning 2001. Julianne Moore plays Laura Brown in the 50s, and Nicole Kidman plays the author Virginia Woolf in the 1920s. Supporting roles include roles from Ed Harris, John C. Reilly, Stephen Delane, Jeff Daniels, Miranda Richardson, Allison Janney, Toni Collette, and Claire Danes. Kind of a who's who of supporting roles right there. A lot of big names. This movie was based on the 1999 Pulitzer Prize-winning novel by Michael Cunningham, and the plot focuses on 3 women of different generations whose lives are interconnected by the novel Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. Now, these women are Clarissa Vaughn, who's a New Yorker preparing an award party for her AIDS-stricken longtime friend and poet Richard in 2001. Then you have Laura Brown, who's a pregnant 1950s California housewife who has a young boy in an unhappy marriage. And finally, Virginia Woolf herself in 1920s England. Now she's struggling with depression and mental illness while she's trying to write her novel. This movie actually garnered 1 Oscar. It won Best Actress for Nicole Kidman. It was kind of polarizing as far as the reviews of Kidman's performance. A lot of people couldn't get through the prosthetic nose that she had, and she looks completely different. If you know what Nicole Kidman looks like and you see her in this movie, you're not going to know it's Nicole Kidman unless you know that she's in the movie. I'm sure there were people that saw this movie that had no idea who was starring in it and then saw the credits roll and said, who the heck was Nicole Kidman in this film? Well, she was Virginia Woolf. As far as the critical reception of The Hours, Rotten Tomatoes gives it an 81%, 7.4 out of 10 average. It gets an 81 out of 100 on Metacritic, and New York Times reviewer Stephen Holden called the film deeply moving and an amazingly faithful screen adaptation. Mick LaSalle of the San Francisco Chronicle says that Daldry employs the wonderful things cinema can do in order to realize the aspects of The Hours that Cunningham could only hint at or approximate on the page. Peter Travers gave it a somewhat of a glowing review, but said that it's just somewhat, or sometimes, stumbles on literary pretensions. As far as the box office success, it garnered $108,846,072. That made it the 47th highest grossing film of 2002, so definitely not in a high esteem as far as that goes. And the soundtrack was by minimalist composer Philip Glass, and it won the BAFTA Award for Best Film Music. So let's get into our review now of The Hours. All right, guys, as far as the plot goes, I'm going to give the plot a 2 out of 5. I think what it did well was it represented a nostalgia comfort food kind of feeling, if you will, of the 1950s. Actually, food is used a lot in all three stages of this film. But the 1950s way that it was kind of depicted on the screen, I thought I liked that plot somewhat. The present day story as well, they somewhat cleverly tie in. I'm not going to get into exactly what happens if you haven't seen the movie, but both of those stories cleverly tie in. I like that about the plot. However, most of the plot I was not a big fan of. I thought it just had an overall theme of hopelessness. It just seemed that even choosing quote-unquote life and not being in a state of depression all the time is still a state of depression to me, is what this movie really depicts. Suicide is a big theme in this film. Mental depression is a big theme in this film. I don't see much light at the end of the tunnel, though, in this film. The plot kind of goes through this murkiness, and it doesn't end on a happy note. It doesn't even end on a hopeful note. It just, to me, ends on just a murky, dark note. So the plot really has no redeeming qualities, but it does kind of muddle through a little bit in an almost unmotivated way. Acting-wise, for The Hours, I give The Hours 2.5 out of 5 for acting. I think the actor that outshined everyone else was the little boy in the 1950s who plays Julianne Moore's character's son. I thought that his eyes were very expressive, his emotions were very expressive. I did read or watch the documentary on the film, and I saw that Stephen Daldry, the director, instead of actually telling him, hey, look sad when your mom tells you this, look happy when your dad tells you this, he actually told him fairy tales. And he was reacting to the fairy tales that he was being told, and they would use that footage that they would record of him reacting to those fairy tales, and they would use them in the movie as appropriate. I did think overall, though, the movie had a disconnect with emotion. It was a movie about depression and mental illness and bipolar disorder and all that stuff, and it just seemed to have a disconnect to it. It didn't seem to really grab me as far as really understanding the characters. I thought John C. Reilly's character as the father in the 1950s was way too goofy, way too over the top, and this romanticized 1950s way of going about things I thought was a little too romanticized. We'll get into that in a little bit. I think the Meryl Streep and Richard Harris dynamic, their relationship was very ugly looking, and it was not built up at all. I didn't like Ed Harris's character in the film. I just thought he was mean, and I don't know how he could withstand or maintain a relationship with anyone unless it was AIDS that actually kind of made him that way. I don't know. I thought Kidman was very non-emotional, and I guess that's what she was going for in the Virginia Woolf character, but she just seemed vapid and completely out of introspection in this character. And I don't really blame Nicole Kidman for it. I blame kind of the writing for it, that Virginia Woolf was kind of reduced to this depressing figure that you don't see much intelligence in, as far as, oh, she's a genius writer, which she was. Very rigid. As far as the directing and cinematography for The Hours, I give that a 3 out of 5. Again, I thought the tract housing scenes in the 1950s segment were well filmed. capturing a nostalgic aura, maybe not a true aura of the 1950s, but definitely that nostalgic Donna Reed show, Leave It to Beaver kind of look to 1950s housing and the neighborhood. The 1920s England part was nice, without much attention to detail. The drowning scenes were probably the ones that kind of stand out mostly to my mind with Virginia Woolf. The present day, quote-unquote present day, of course 2001 is not present day anymore, that's for sure. Darkly filmed and just depressing. And again, I guess that's what they were going for, but it was almost a very sleepy tonal quality to the movie. Soundtrack. I give the soundtrack a 3.5 out of 5. I think as an album, if you just divorce yourself of the movie, the album's a very, very good album. There's very, very over-dramatic parts of the music that really seem to me just to over-dramatize the movie, which really doesn't need more sadness to it, but it really does over-dramatize the movie to me. And the sweeping music enhances some of the despair, some of the mental despair that goes on in this film. And the overall aura of The Hours, I give just a 1.5 out of 5. It's my lowest score yet, and I really think the only plausibility factor of this film that probably earns it the half a star that I gave it over 1 is that you do kind of, I guess, get a sense of an awareness of mental illness, maybe not one as strong as you'd want, but you do get an awareness of it and an awareness of depression and how deep people go into this darkness. I absolutely hate the Julianne Moore arc in this film, her 1950s character. She's almost presented with a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of choice, kind of like a Sophie's Choice, I guess you can call it. Double-edged sword kind of thing. Both edges of the sword, you're thinking, was that really the only option? Was that all that she had? And she is so strongly convinced that the decision she made was the decision she had to make, 100% had to make. And I'm not convinced. I'm just not convinced. I can't get inside people's head. I know people have their own kind of way of going about doing things, but I just didn't think this was very strong. And I hated it. Hated it. And I just feel so disattached to this film. I just don't have any attachment to it whatsoever. I've never been in that kind of state of depression, and my heart goes out to anyone who has been, but I just can't get inside the mind and can't understand what significance this movie plays. I can't do it. So going through the entire synopsis here for The Hours, I give the plot a 2, acting a 2.5, directing and cinematography a 3, soundtrack a 3.5, and aura a 1.5, giving it a total of 12.5 out of 25 and a score of 50.
The defenses have to hold.
They will hold.
There's nothing for you here, only death.
There is still hope.
It's the 2002 epic high fantasy adventure film The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, directed by Peter Jackson, and of course based on the second volume of J.R.R. Tolkien's novel The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. And it's also the second installment of the Lord of the Rings film series, preceded, of course, by The Fellowship of the Ring, and then concluding with The Return of the King. Now, this movie continues the plot of The Fellowship. Of course, the film intercuts 3 storylines. You have Frodo and Sam continuing their journey toward Mordor to destroy the One Ring, meeting and joined by Gollum, who, of course, is the ring's former owner. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli come to the war-torn nation of Rohan and are reunited with the resurrected Gandalf, before fighting at the Battle of Helm's Deep. Now, Merry and Pippin, the third plot, escape capture, meet Treebeard, and then help plan an attack on Isengard. Cast: Elijah Wood reprises his role as Frodo, Ian McKellen plays Gandalf, Liv Tyler plays Arwen, Viggo Mortensen plays Aragorn. The movie, just like all 3 movies, was filmed in New Zealand. The Battle of Helm's Deep was designed by Alan Lee, and what a job he did on the construction. Principal photography took place from October 1999 to December of 2000, and it took them 3 months, actually, to film the Battle of Helm's Deep. And if you see this battle, it's one of the most epic battles you'll ever see on the big screen. Weta Digital doubled its special effects staff of about 260, and the animation of Gollum began in late 1998. The character Treebeard took between 28 and 48 hours per frame to render, and the musical score was composed, orchestrated, and conducted by Howard Shore. These are just production notes, I guess you can call it. The movie was the highest-grossing 2002 film worldwide, raking in $926,047,000
$111. And a critical darling of a movie, 96% on Rotten Tomatoes, 246 reviews, 8.5 average, and 88 out of 100 on Metacritic. And the quote, "My precious," from Gollum, number 85 among movie quotes of all time, according to the American Film Institute. So let's get into our review now of Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. As far as the plot goes, I give the plot a 3.5 out of 5. I really think this movie furthers the saga of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. A lot of events depicting the ever-growing world of Middle-earth, and it could have gotten really, really murky and really confusing, but they did a really good job kind of keeping that down a little bit. And it really showcases the struggle of basically the whole world being involved in this war for Middle-earth. I thought the introduction of new characters and the lands were done with minimal confusion. There are some parts where if you're not familiar with the books, or even if you are somewhat familiar with the books, you kind of have to really, really study and really kind of get intertwined in the plot of this movie, because it takes a couple of watches really to get exactly what's going on, I think. There are a few abrupt cuts, and the plot jumps forward a little bit with some parts that don't have much explanation. That's fixed in the director's cut. Now, I watched the theatrical version of this movie, which I thought was the fair way to review this, because that was what was up for Best Picture, was the theatrical version, not the director's cut. The director's cut is pretty much flawless, in my opinion, but I had to rate it fairly. As far as the acting of The Two Towers, I give the acting a 4 out of 5. I think the same cast mostly delivered, coming back with even some notable new characters in the mix as well. I think Gollum was memorable. A lot of people walk away thinking, hey, Gollum was the star of the show. I think he was great. However, I think there are times where Gollum could be annoying. And I also, I know Gandalf the White acts a little different than Gandalf the Grey in the books, but I just have a soft spot in my heart for Gandalf the Grey. He was kind of almost a curmudgeonly wizard. He was very knowledgeable, obviously, and had a lot of magic going for him and stuff like that. But Gandalf the White seemed a little too godlike to me. It was the same way in the books, so, I mean, he was depicted well in the movie, according to the books. Directing and cinematography of Two Towers, I give a 5 out of 5. I think, as with the other two movies, a definite groundbreaking film in the world of special effects, in the world of storytelling and acting. Really good. I think the Battle of Helm's Deep is some of the best battle scenes you'll ever see in movies. And along with the third movie's battle, the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, I think two of the best movie battle scenes of the entire decade of the 2000s. And we're really transported, really mentally into a new world, especially Treebeard's world at Fangorn Forest. As for soundtrack, I give the soundtrack a 5 out of 5. I think it's another Howard Shore masterpiece. All three films are masterpieces as far as the soundtrack goes as well. An epic feel. I mean, the music is fitting of what you're seeing on screen, because the music is very, very epic, very grandiose. They use a full symphony orchestra, and it's one of those soundtracks that you got to go out and buy, basically all three of them. Overall aura of Two Towers, I give a 5 out of 5. I think you couple the movie with the other two, and it's just a masterpiece in the realm of fantasy, unlike anything that's ever been done before. For years, they had been bandying about the idea of doing Lord of the Rings, but they just didn't have the technology to do it justice. They did a couple of cartoons of Lord of the Rings, nothing really live action that did it any justice, and this is the first one that did, and it knocked it out of the ballpark. I remember the movie for Helm's Deep, remember it for Gandalf coming back as Gandalf the White, and just the other worlds that we're transported to, I think, really add to the overall aura of this film. So let's get into our total as we tally up the results. 3.5 for plot, 4 for acting, 5 for directing and cinematography, 5 for soundtrack and sound editing, and 5 for aura, giving The Two Towers, Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, that is, a total of 22.5 out of 25 and a score of 90.
This is the greatest pianist in Poland, maybe the whole world.
No one plays Chopin like you.
I hope it's a compliment.
By order of the governor of the Warsaw district, there will be created a Jewish district in which all Jews will have to reside.
You must get away at once.
The 2002 historical drama film The Pianist, or The Pianist, however you want to pronounce it, co-produced and directed by Roman Polanski. It was scripted by Ronald Harwood, and it stars Adrian Brody as Władysław Spielman. Now, Adrian Brody won Best Actor for his role as Spielman, and he remains the youngest Best Actor winner at age 29, I believe. Still to this day, as of recording time. Thomas Kretschmann plays Captain Wilhelm Hosenfeld. Frank Finlay plays Samuel Spielmann. Maureen Lipman plays Eduarda Spielmann. Those are Władysław's parents. And the movie was based on an autobiographical book called The Pianist, a World War II memoir by the Polish-Jewish pianist and composer Władysław Spielmann. It's a co-production between France, the UK, Germany, and Poland. And as I mentioned, it won Best Actor for Adrian Brody. Best Director, Roman Polanski won Best Director that year. And it also won Adapted Screenplay. So it was one of the more awarded films of the 2003 Academy Awards. And the plot focuses on a brilliant pianist, a Polish Jew, who witnesses restrictions in Germany on Jews in the Polish capital from restricted access to the building of the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, as his family is rounded up to be shipped off to the Nazi labor camps, he escapes deportation and eludes capture by living in the ruins of Warsaw. Unbelievable sequence of events from beginning to end in this movie. The transition is just absolutely amazing. Production-wise, Polanski actually escaped Krakow. He escaped the Krakow Ghetto as a child after the death of his mother, so quite an amazing childhood that he had. Of course, things that happened later in his life are very, very controversial. We won't get into those. Joseph Fiennes was actually Polanski's first choice to play Spielmann, but he turned down the role due to previous commitments. And the movie was filmed in Germany. They had to also recreate the Warsaw Ghetto. I believe that was done on a Hollywood set. Much of Poland was pretty much obliterated during World War II, so they had to recreate what things look like. As far as the reception goes for The Pianist, very, very high acclaim. It gets a 96% score on Rotten Tomatoes out of 178 reviews, an 8.2 out of 10 average. Gets an 85 out of 100 on Metacritic. Roger Ebert said that showing Spielmann as a survivor, not a hero, was a great way of going about doing it. It didn't over-heroize his character. Heroize, I don't even know if that's a word, but I'm using it anyway. Michael Wilmington of the Chicago Tribune called it the best dramatic feature he's seen on the Holocaust experience. And that includes, at that moment of time, of course, Schindler's List, which a lot of people believe is the best actual Holocaust movie, but Michael Wilmington had a different opinion. So let's get into our review now of The Pianist, or The Pianist, however you want to pronounce it. As far as the plot goes, I give the plot a 4 out of 5. I really liked that it was more centered on following the history of the Warsaw Ghetto. And I do agree with Ebert that it didn't really focus on Spielmann as not even really too much of a central character. He was the central character, but things going on around him were really the star, I thought, of this movie. And I really liked that. And as you're watching it, as you're going through it, especially if you don't know the history, which not a lot of people going into it have read the autobiography of Spielmann, you wonder, does he get out? How does he get out? If he does, what happens? What can happen next? And I like that. The plot keeps you guessing, even though it's a historically accurate film. There are a few loose ties in the film and some disappointing ways that things tie in at the end, and I'm not going to get into them too much. It is all based on truth, but there is disappointment as far as what happened here, what happened to this person, what happened to that person. You don't really get any closure. For the acting, I give the acting a 3.5 out of 5. I think Adrian Brody by far was the standout actor in this film. Very solid. He shines through the film. I liked the guy who played his father, who, by the way, just died. Actor Frank Finlay just died in 2016. Plays Samuel Spielmann. I thought he was good. I did not like the guy who played the brother. The brother in the movie, I think, is overbearing and annoying, and he's kind of playing a rebellious character who's really trying to, obviously show up the Nazis, and I like his will and his fight, but man, I just cannot stand that. The character is very annoying to me, the guy who plays his brother. Not a big fan. And, other than that, there are a lot of vanilla kind of characters, characters that you don't really latch on to, with the exception maybe of Thomas Kretschmann, who plays Captain Wilhelm Hosenfeld. He's a guy that you don't really see till near the end of the movie, but I won't get into it too much. Directing and cinematography, I give a 3.5 out of 5. Great use of grayness. These Holocaust films, and many World War II films, you always notice when they take place in Europe, man, it's so much gray, so much snow. Like, didn't they ever have any sunny days out there? You always think, like, it's this constant cloud cover and grayness and depression all the time. I know the war's never happy, but, my gosh, there's never any sunny days out there. The thing that really struck me, though, are the dead bodies in the film. There's so many scenes where people are just walking around, and there's like dead children on the road. There's dead, people dying, and it's so heart-wrenching, and they just have to keep going. And it really is done in a way in which we, the viewers, I suppose, look at it and go, man, this is awful. It's really getting to me. But those on screen seem somewhat unfazed because they're used to it, I suppose. Not that you could ever get used to that. It is a little too consistent, I think. The style is a little too consistent with Spielberg's Schindler's List movie. A little bit. Kind of put me in mind of it. Of course, the subject matter was the same, but just the way it was filmed, I thought, kind of was a little too consistent with Schindler's List. Soundtrack-wise, I give the soundtrack a 3 out of 5. I think it serves its purpose. It's mostly piano music by Chopin. A very safe kind of soundtrack, if that means anything, and not quite as orchestral as I would like it to be. Of course, the movie is about a pianist, so you should have piano music in your soundtrack, but not really too memorable, just a very safe kind of soundtrack. And the overall aura of the film, I give it my highest mark. I give it a 4.5 out of 5. I thought it really definitely had me going to Wikipedia afterwards. I wanted to research more about the Warsaw Ghetto, wanted to research about this Warsaw Ghetto rebellion, this uprising they had. I never knew about that, and I really went all over the place kind of researching the history of it all, and that's what I took away from the movie. The violence in the movie, I know a lot of movies have violence, a lot of these Holocaust movies have violence, but this is a different kind of violence. There's a scene in the beginning where they're in the ghetto, the first days of the ghetto, I suppose, where the whole Spielman family is looking out the window at this SS raid on this family, and there's an older, I guess, grandfather in a wheelchair, and what they do with him is, oh my gosh, it will just send shivers up and down your spine. It'll stick with you. The way the violence is depicted really is horrific and grotesque and something that really will grab you. But that's almost what you have to do in a Holocaust film. I think the scenes of Warsaw after all the Russian-German fighting and all that stuff, and the way the city looked, oh my gosh, it was amazingly depicted. And of course, the scenes with Captain Wilhelm Hosenfeld and the ongoings of that part of the movie, I definitely take a lot of weight from too. So let's tally the results. We have a 4 for plot, a 3.5 for acting, a 3.5 for directing and cinematography, a 3 for soundtrack, a 4.5 for aura, giving The Pianist a total of 18.5 out of 25 and a score of 74.
You're supposed to say, and the Oscar goes to.
And the winner is... Chicago!
Okay, so with everything being equal, I do not think that the Academy made the right decision in 2002. I really strongly felt against it back then, but this time I feel a little bit better about Chicago. I know I didn't like Chicago the first time I saw it, but I have more of an appreciation for the film Chicago since I saw it again. Not the greatest film of all time, but definitely something that was a little better than I had remembered it. They were all good movies with the exception, in my opinion, of The Hours. I was not a big fan of The Hours, as you know from my review, so I gave that kind of a low score. But, Gangs of New York was good. The Pianist was very good as well. But as I felt in 2003, I think The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers was deserving of Best Picture. That's what I would have voted for. I just think all three of these films were groundbreaking films. I remember The Fellowship, believing The Fellowship should have won Best Picture in 2002, and I know A Beautiful Mind won, which is a great movie in itself, and I was fine with that, and I was happy that Return of the King won the following year. But I think this year, the field was a decent enough field, but not a great field of movies. But one of them just blew them all out of the water, and I thought that was The Two Towers. So, Two Towers was my pick, and maybe it was yours. Maybe it was another one. I don't know. We'll do another year next time around.
Well, we're finally at the halfway mark. I have so many people to thank tonight, but especially Steven Spielberg. Why? Because it can't hurt. And to our young men and women who are watching overseas, we are thinking of you. We hope you enjoyed the show. It is for you. Good night.